Hi, friends. This is John. I'm passionate about developing regenerative agriculture systems that improve soil health, produce crops that are completely resistant to diseases and insects, and produce food of such an exceptional quality that we can have a legitimate conversation about growing food as medicine. I've been fortunate to meet many people with incredible knowledge and information about soil and plant systems. However, much of this knowledge and information is scattered all over the place. There are many incredible stories and a lot of knowledge that have not been widely shared. I founded Advancing Eco-Agriculture in 2006 to bring this knowledge together in a more coherent fashion and incorporate it into products and growing systems that growers can easily put into practice. It's my personal mission to have these regenerative agriculture systems become the mainstream globally, the status quo against which all other growing systems are compared. To achieve this goal, I want to share the knowledge that we have learned in the last decade and make it available to everyone. These concepts and principles about regenerative systems can be applied anywhere, and when they're properly applied, they will increase farm profitability and resilience to climate stress. If you have any questions, suggestions, comments, or topics of ideas that you would like for me to discuss, please connect on social media or email me, john@regenerativeagriculturepodcast.com. Be sure to sign up for our email list at regenerativeagriculturepodcast.com. Hope you enjoy, and thank you for listening. Because AEA produces this show, that means that we do not have to sell ads and we're not beholden to advertisers. This gives me the freedom to host anyone that brings value to the community and to gift free promotional space to organizations that help impact the regenerative agriculture movement. You'll notice that this season we're airing short messages from organizations that are doing great work in the sphere of regenerative agriculture and food. Part awareness spreading, part thank you, part community impact service. We realize that this show is a great platform to offer a wide audience to folks that we want to support. We hope that you'll check them out and get involved and support them as well.
This is Gerry Hatfield. I'm the director of the National Lab for Agriculture and Environment in Ames, Iowa. The ARS is the research branch of USDA. We conduct research across the nation on behalf of agricultural producers, and our focus really is to look at how soil changes relative to management. How can we improve our soils not only for production efficiency, but how it influences all ecosystem services in terms of environmental quality, habitat for pollinators, water quality, this intersection between agriculture and the environment. If you want to work with us on on-farm research, contact us at www.ars.usda.gov/NLAE.
I'm excited to be here with David Montgomery, who's published several books that have led him to the regenerative agriculture movement. And David doesn't come from an agronomy background, but instead has been approaching this from a geology and a geomorphology perspective. David, you've written a couple of really great books. You've written Dirt and The Hidden Half of Nature, Growing a Revolution, your most recent book, which I think has been very widely acclaimed in the regenerative agriculture space. What brought you to this pathway? How did you get started researching agriculture?
Oh, thanks, John. I actually came to it because I'm the kind of geologist that studies erosion. I study what shapes the surface of the earth, and so when you think about what shapes hillsides or mountains, you're really talking about erosion. So I've studied erosion for decades, but mostly from a very long-term perspective. You know, how it shapes the surface of the world that we know and walk around on. And I came to thinking about agriculture really by that first book, the Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations book, the first book I wrote that dealt with soils. It was an attempt to try and bridge my interest in landscape evolution and how erosion works, my training and background in that, with thinking about the way that soil erosion had affected ancient civilizations. And I thought it would be a great way to visit places around the world that visit ancient societies and bring my training to bear on what I thought would be an intellectually interesting story. And it turned out that as I was writing that book, I ended up writing a book about the history of farming, because that's really where the connection between soil erosion, soil degradation over the long term connects back to human societies. The story really was one of how farming practices had affected the fertility of the land over millennia and generations, and how that had affected human societies. So I started from this big picture, long-term perspective, looking at how agriculture has influenced people in sort of a slightly different way than we normally think about. And that started me on the road to where I've eventually ended up today, is thinking about regenerative agriculture as a way to solve the problems that I was talking about and identified in the Dirt book. So I came at regenerative agriculture kind of from a different angle than I think most people come to it from. But it's been a very illuminating journey for me. And I hope for readers along the way that have sort of shared in my growth and education as I've looked into this.
David, you're speaking about erosion as being a primary problem, and I heard a data point a couple of years ago that really caught my attention, that the state of Iowa loses 2 pounds of topsoil for every pound of corn produced.
How is that going to last, right? Yeah, and we've already degraded something like a third of the world's agricultural land to the point where it's not really being used commercially for agriculture, and we're on the path to do another 30% or so this century, according to the UN's 2015 Global State of the Soil Report. If we're basically losing the soil through the ways that we grow our food, then we're effectively mining the soil to feed ourselves today. And I mean, one of the most amazing things about the soil as a physical entity on Earth is that it's naturally renewable. It's a very renewable resource if we steward it and shepherd it and take care of it. But it's also mineable if we use it faster than we're regenerating it. We can quite literally run out of it, and societies in different parts of the world have done that in the past. And we're as your story from Iowa illustrates, we're on track to do that again with erosive farming practices today. Yet we've made great strides as well. And I've turned from something of a pessimist into something of an unrepentant optimist on this issue. I think we can actually solve this problem. That's what the whole Growing Revolution book was about. But yeah, those statistics like you were just citing are those kind of things that slap you in the face and go, wow, something's got to change here.
When you think about shifting from a pessimist to an optimist, one of the questions that comes to my mind is, how big is the problem really? Isn't the problem inflated?
Well, there's actually sort of two dimensions to the problem. And some people will have the problem in the public sphere has been inflated to some degree. There's a series of articles that made the rounds, I think, a few years ago, where someone was saying, someone at the UN said we're going to totally run out of soil in 60 years. And, that's not going to happen. But we are on track to degrade enough of it that it will impact our ability to feed people. That part's true. But there's really two dimensions to the soil degradation problem. And one is the actual erosion and loss of the soil. And that's a bigger problem in some parts of the world than others. But the other part is the degradation of the fertility of the soil, the loss of soil organic matter. And whether you look across the U.S. as a whole or globally, the estimates are we've degraded something like half of the soil organic matter from our agricultural fields. And if you understand soil organic matter as the sort of the lifeblood of the life in the soil, if you will, the currency that keeps that whole underground biological economy going, that's real cause for concern, because once you degrade the soil through loss of organic matter enough, you basically become hooked on relying on agrochemicals to maintain agricultural production. And if that production is tied very much to fossil fuels, all these problems compound in terms of the challenges we face this century. So, in some areas, the soil loss problem has been somewhat inflated, but it's a very serious problem. And a really key problem to why it's been so difficult to solve is that it happens relatively slowly. It's a problem that plays out over decades and centuries. And sometimes, ironically, it's the slower things that are kind of harder for us to deal with and stop, because they don't always rise to the crisis du jour.
When you describe the scope of the problem, David, it is, thinking about losing half of our soil's productive capacity over the last several centuries, it's quite intriguing to consider that you've become an optimist and thinking that we can correct it. What's the pathway to correcting the problem?
Boy, yeah, it's if you'd asked me 10 years ago when I was finishing the Dirt book if I'd become an unrepentant optimist on this issue, I might not have believed it. I struggled really hard with how to write the last chapter of that book. And in fact, the version that ended up in the book was my third attempt, because the first two were too depressing for me to want to actually put out there in the world. And what I came down with in the dirt book is I recommended essentially trying to figure out how to get no-till farming and organic farming to work together, which was a real challenge in terms of weed control and organic systems, and how to use no-till systems without the herbicides that 10 years ago were so essential to most people's use of that. And what really turned me into an optimist was actually going out over the next 5 years or so after that book came out and speaking at conferences where farmers were speaking. And I'd be asked to give a talk on this sort of the history of soil erosion and the backwards looking view of a geologist. But I would also then, attend the conference, and I had started seeing talks from people like Gabe Brown and Dwayne Beck, people who were farmers who had restored fertility to very degraded land. And they did it through intensive agriculture, through practices that were growing a lot of food, but that were rebuilding the health and fertility of their soil. And I started thinking, I need to go visit some of these guys. I need to, look at their farms, dig holes in their farms, dig holes in their neighbors' farms, think about what's happening to the soil, and find out what are the real sort of tricks and secrets behind what they're doing. And part of what catalyzed me into going off and taking 6 months to travel around the world and interview farmers like that was at the same time as I was finishing the dirt book. My wife who's a gardener. She's a biologist and a major league gardener. We had bought a house in North Seattle, and she took on a project to restore the soil in our yard. And she did it far faster than I could have guessed that it would have happened. Within 4 or 5 years of her intensive composting and mulching and returning organic matter to the soil in our yard, we're starting to see the soil change color. The soil came back to life. Animals started coming back to our yard in what turned out to be pretty much the same order in which life evolved on Earth, from microbes to arachnids to worms to pollinators and different styles of plants, all the way up to an eagle that ate the baby crow that was eating the worms that were eating the organic matter that Ann added to the yard. And finally, the drunk that came and added the human cherry on top. But seeing our soil in our yard come back to life so fast, in less than a decade, going from less than 1% organic matter up to about 8 to 10% across the yard, and just the transformative effect that it had on the above ground biology, really started me thinking and Ann thinking about, wow, could you do this at scale on real farms? And that's where, having seen these talks by the Gabe Browns of the world and the Dwayne Becks of the world, sort of set me off on a path to ask, well, could you do on farms with commercially viable agriculture what Ann had done in our yard with, a very souped up hobby in terms of gardening in her case? And I started learning from regenerative farmers who had decades of experience in tinkering around with their methods and how they would actually rebuild the fertility of their soil. And I'm kind of a synthesizer. I like to look for patterns and draw the generalities out. And so I traveled around talking to farmers like that, and then stood back and asked the question of, what did all these people have in common? What was the framework? And it lines up really well with what we think of today as regenerative agriculture.
David, that is perfect. That's exactly the place that I was hoping to go next. What we've observed in our work at Advancing Eco-Agriculture is exceptional instances where soils, even under commercial cropping production systems, are gaining as much as a 0.5 percentage point of organic matter per year. And there is this constant question that keeps coming up is that repeatable? Can we do that consistently?
Right.
Can we do it on
Right.
a large scale? So within that context, what are the tools and practices that growers were using to deliver those results consistently?
Well, there was a consistent set of principles that tracked across all the really successful ones that I visited. And they may not be the only principles out there that would work, but they worked in these cases. But the actual practices that the people used in different regions were completely different. So those principles were things like, don't disturb the ground surface. So it was minimal disturbance, no-till practices, or a minimum of superficial disturbance in terms of light disking or stuff. But everyone that I visited who was very successful had gone the no disturbance route in one sort of variety of no-till or another. They all kept the ground surface covered. They all planted cover crops. So there was a living plant in the soil at all times. It was sort of the don't farm naked kind of philosophy. And the third one was that they all had rotations or diversity in their cover crops that were more than about 4 crops. So it was a complex rotation, much more complex than, say, corn, 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 or corn, soybeans.
I think that's the antithesis of complexity.
Yes, exactly. I like to say that corn and soybeans is not a rotation. So it's, with those things in terms of minimal disturbance, keeping cover crops and diversity, that was the foundation that was really across the board. Some of the people I visited were reintroducing animal agriculture and reintegrating it with their cropping systems. And I came to view that as not an essential element of soil restoration, but something that has the potential to be a tremendous accelerator in the sense that, say you bring in cattle to graze off a cover crop. Then if you, by using the cattle to terminate the cover crop, you're accelerating the breakdown of the cover crop back into soluble forms of nutrients that the plant can take back up, because what comes out in the manure is more processed and broken down and full of microbes than just leaving the stalks on the on the surface of the ground. So, and at the highest level, what really seemed to be the root of regenerative farming, that farming practices that work to regenerate the fertility of the soil, were a system that would cultivate the beneficial life in the soil. And if you think about sort of the dominant way that we've looked at agriculture in the conventional world for the last century, it's been about how do we sort of manage or kill the things we don't want on the fields, rather than how do we cultivate the kind of conditions for life in the soil that will help our crops thrive using their own natural defense systems and their partners, their allies, if you will, in the root zone, the bacteria and the fungi that work in conjunction with plants, and the kind of mutually beneficial symbiotic relationships that Ann and I wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature. And there's lots of different ways to try and actually promote and cultivate the beneficial life in the soil. But if you look at the kind of principles of ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity that are behind those 3 big conservation agriculture principles, that's about a 180-degree philosophical shift from what we've been teaching people in ag schools for the last 80 years as the backbone of conventional farming, where it was heavy tillage with lots of agrochemicals and specializing in 1 or 2 crops. So it's the real key seemed to be, first of all, thinking about the place of the soil really differently in our philosophy of farming, and then layering on the practices that cultivate the beneficial life in the soil.
David, in the conversations that you've had with farmers and the conversations that I've had with growers and agronomists, I find the perspective that you expressed on livestock to be a common theme. Generally, the really successful agronomists and growers who are regenerating soil health are incorporating livestock into the ecosystem in some manner, if at all possible. It's not always, but if possible, they're incorporating them. And I find that this is a commonly held perspective, and it is completely contrary to the celebrity perspective of veganism being and vegan diets and no meat diets being the solution to climate change.
Yeah, no, that's I've been working on a textbook on sustainability for my publisher for the last 5 years. So we're almost done, but we've been trying to integrate the sort of social science and biological and physical science at an introductory level to follow all those things. And one of the most challenging bits of that was taking the sort of the draft parts on agriculture that dealt with livestock and its place in sustainability for that very reason, because the sort of the go-to, as you put it, the celebrity perspective of, we must go vegetarian to save the world. It actually really depends, I think, a lot on how livestock is raised as to what their net environmental impact actually is. And this is where my own thinking has evolved quite a lot over the last 10 years. Because when I was finishing the dirt book, there's lots of examples historically where overgrazing didn't destroy the soil, but it kept the soil from rebuilding. And there's places where it caused gullies, the Southwest of California, good places where it's been well demonstrated that if you graze livestock for too long in the same place in the valley bottoms in a landscape where that's where the only water is, it causes arroyos, gullies to develop. So I came to the problem of animals in agriculture from that perspective. Oh, cows are bad; they cause erosion. But seeing people who had actually used their livestock in different ways, and as a tool of soil rebuilding, as in effect as self-propelled methane digesters that can convert cover crops into manure, and thereby accelerate the cycling of nutrients in the soil. And seeing people have had success turning 1 or 2% organic matter soils into much richer 5, 6, 8% organic matter soils over the course of a decade or so, convinced me that there's a different way to look at livestock in the whole agricultural equation. And so I think we can certainly point to the adverse environmental impacts of confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs, where we feed livestock corn grown with conventional practices, mining the soil and using a lot of fossil fuels to then take that 10-to-1 hit on the food chain, where you're spending 10 times the energy to get something for that next trophic level. It's not a very efficient way overall to generate calories for people. And so in that sense, the celebrity perspective has some legs on it. The way we tend to grow livestock is not a great environmentally. But if you turn around and look at, there's all these great areas of the world that are grasslands and semi-arid grassland environments where moisture is a big challenge in terms of growing a lot of crops, and conventional practices are erosive. And you look at, what's the best way to use those landscapes to feed people? And cows do this amazing thing of turning grass, something we can't eat, and which grows over a quarter of the continents or something, into product. Cattle will turn that into meat and dairy that we actually can eat. And if you integrate them back with cropping, they can actually help sustain the fertility of the land. So my perspective on the whole livestock issue these days has changed radically. And I'm convinced that livestock can be a component of soil restoration and regeneration, but it's all about how we manage the livestock. The problem is not the livestock. The problem is what we do with the livestock.
Very well spoken. Completely agree, and I can't even expand on that. David, you've approached soil health from a geology perspective and the historical perspective of many geologists that it takes a really long time to build soils. So, as a reformed geologist, and now that you've had conversations with many different farmers, what are the realistic expectations? How rapidly can we rebuild soil health, and what should we be striving for?
You've just hit on half of the equation that turned me into an optimist on this issue. Because if you go back to sort of a basic geology textbook, say, you'll find, or if you even actually just measure the rate at which nature builds soils, you end up getting rates of it takes centuries to millennia to build an inch of fertile soil. And, credible estimates for how fast nature builds soil on average on the planet, 500 to 1,000 years per inch is probably a decent average. But, it's highly variable. There's lots of different environments in the world. But that rate presumes you're taking a rock and turning it into soil. And, I've got rocks all over my garden or all over my wife's garden that I've brought home from all over the world. And they don't break down very fast, even here in the Northwest where it rains all the time. Rocks are pretty stable. It takes centuries to millennia to break a rock down and turn it into soil. But one of the things that Anne taught me with the lesson of the garden was that if you already have the mineral matter, and in our yard we had ground up bits of British Columbia granite that a glacier delivered down to Seattle 15,000 years ago. So we had the mineral part of soil. It was all broken up, or you can dig it up. What we didn't have was the organic matter. We didn't have the biology. We didn't have the life. And it turns out that you can restore, the key to restoring soil fertility rapidly isn't thinking about making it from scratch. It's thinking about starting with the geological part of it and adding the biology. Because you can add the biology, you can kickstart the biology really fast. If you've got to wait to break down a piece of granite into sand, you're going to be waiting a long time. But if you're basically trying to figure out how do you get organic matter into the broken up mineral particles of a soil where the rocks have already been crushed up, you can actually do it real fast. And that's where the rates of, you know, a quarter to a third to even a 0.5% organic matter increase per year are actually feasible if you've got the mineral part and you focus on how to actually kickstart that biology, and bring life literally back to the soil. That's the subtitle of Growing Revolution, bringing our soils back to life. It is meant to be taken literally. Putting life back in the soil is the key to rebuilding soil quite rapidly. And by quite rapidly, I'm a geologist, so I think 10, 20 years is actually screamingly fast. That could test the patience of an individual farmer, but there's enough people now who have experience in rebuilding the fertility of soils that I think there's a good experiential database to draw on for how to accelerate that in different parts of the world. So if we could actually make major headway on restoring organic matter in soils over the course of a decade, whether it's at 0.2% or 0.3% increase a year, you play that out over a decade and you're starting to get into the 2-3+% range, even at what could be a very feasible and low rate of improvement. And at the high end, with the examples you were talking about earlier, about a 0.5% or so a year, if I recall what you're saying, that's sort of at the high end of the examples I saw as well. I think it's feasible. And the reason I think it's feasible is because I've seen people that have done it. And I'm an empiricist. If it's been done, it can be done.
Yeah, it has been done, and it's been done on a substantial scale, on a scale of thousands of acres,
Yeah.
which I think answers about whether it's scalable.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that one of the big revelations to me in Growing a Revolution was that these principles are totally scalable. The practices you would use to scale them may vary depending on where you are in the world and what kind of technology people have available. But they scale. It's not just something for backyard gardens. There's the biggest farms I was looking at were like 20,000 acres, which to me is a large. That's probably about the size of the city of Seattle.
David, you've approached agriculture from a very different perspective, a perspective that as growers and agronomists we don't often get to think about a great deal. When you think about modern agriculture as it has developed today, what do you believe to be true about modern agriculture that is perhaps different from the mainstream view?
Oh boy. Um, one of the biggest things that I just keep running into and dealing with people in the mainstream media are the idea that we have a choice between sort of environmentally friendly agriculture and feeding the world. That if we go organic, say, that we will all starve to death. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that's out there. And I know that people in the regenerative agriculture space probably aren't in that zone of misconception, but it's a pretty big pool of misconception out there. And so I actually think that the key to sustaining long-term farming is through restoring and accelerating the natural cycles of growth and decay and recycling the way that soils have worked for 450 million years. And that we need to work with those systems rather than try and manipulate and alter those systems. I think that in the 20th century, with the rise of what we now consider conventional agriculture, but which is actually, brand new if you look at it in the big sweep of things.
It should be considered alternative agriculture.
Yeah, it should be considered, that experiment we did in the 20th century. And we should be asking, how well did it work? And at one level, it worked really well to increase crop yields, but it also degraded a lot of our land and certainly and our future ability to grow crops. And there's questions about what it did to the quality of the food that we eat as well, and the nutrient density of foods.
So, David, you've spoken with growers from all over the world. You've written 3 different books, which I highly encourage everyone to read, particularly the last, Growing a Revolution. Once I started reading it, I didn't stop until I was finished. So it's a very enlightening read.
Oh, thank
David,
you.
with this entire pathway that you've been on, what has been something that has surprised you the most? What was the most unexpected?
Well, really the single most unexpected thing was how fast Anne restored the soil in our yard. That was a total eye opener to me because I was coming at it from this. It takes centuries to millennia to grow an inch of soil. kind of perspective. And right under my nose in the backyard, she demonstrated that she could basically turn that around. And she grew, several inches of soil in less than 5 years. And I was just like, there's nothing in the journals that says you can do this. this is like way too fast. And that was one of those sort of light bulb moments. I remember the first time she and I sort of realized that, wow, our soil's changing really fast, was when she had a plant that she wanted to transplant from one place to another. She'd planted it in what she declared a few years later to be the wrong spot. Plant wasn't happy, needed to move. So we dug a hole to move it out. And I think it was about 4 years after she started her organic matter crusade to restore the soil in the yard. And we noticed that, wow, we've got a couple inches of soil here that wasn't there when we started the yard. And that was just a total eye-opener moment. The other kind of eye-opener moments were, I think a big one for me was going to the World Congress on Conservation Agriculture in 2014, because I saw a series of farmers speak there who really sparked the idea in my mind I should go visit some of these people and see their farms and see what I was thinking of, have they done on their farm what Ann did in our yard? And making that connection was sort of a leap up for me in terms of, how do you scale these things? Could you actually do what Ann did, but do it on commercial farms at scale in both the developed and developing world? So those two sort of moments were things where they set me off on the course that culminated in writing Growing a Revolution.
What didn't make it into the book? There's always, every time I write a little bit, and I know that there's always things that you want to put in that don't make it. So I'm curious, what was that for you?
There were hundreds of pages that didn't make it in. I've got these files full of stuff that haven't made it into one book or another. But there's a couple things that we thought about putting into Hidden Half of Nature, didn't make it in there. I thought about doing it in Growing a Revolution, didn't make it in there. But one of them is we have a huge file on glyphosate. And we wrote a bit about glyphosate in both books, but not very much, because we were trying to wade through the sort of the science and didn't get comfortable until fairly recently with how we sort of think about that, and didn't want to commit in writing before I was comfortable that I understood the science enough to know at least to think that I knew what I was saying. And so sort of wrestling with the role of glyphosate as a disruptor of the microbiome, the sort of life in the soil and in the gut of livestock and people, was something that what didn't make it in, because we didn't think we could support the argument to the extent that now in hindsight I think is warranted. So Ann and I are working on a new book now that that stuff may end up getting into. And there was also a trip to South Africa that did not make it into Growing a Revolution. I was to visit a really progressive farm in South Africa, but when the key agronomist wasn't on site when I was there, and so I couldn't interview him, and I just couldn't connect all the dots. It would have made a great story. Maybe someday I'll do a magazine piece on it, because this farmer was keeping cheetahs in his crop circles in South Africa, and he had livestock that instead of using cows the way North American regenerative farmers were, he was using native South African species of grazing ungulates to graze off his cover crops, and then he had cheetahs that would hunt the grazers. And so he had big barbed wire fences around his crop circles saying, "Do not enter."
That does sound like a fascinating story. Was he using the cheetahs to keep the animals grouped?
No, he was using the cheetahs because he was very much into cheetah conservation, and it was as a rehabilitation area for cheetahs that had been displaced or injured in the wild. So it was sort of this complicated story of this particular farm. But I looked at it and went, wow, is this the future of wildlife conservation in parts of the world that get developed for agriculture, where we could actually figure out ways to have predators moving our livestock around, and realize that, the predators are going to take a few of them, but maybe that's a way to keep biodiversity going at a large scale. It was just one of these things that at some point could make a really neat story, because I had yet to be on a farm where you had to worry about yourself being hunted.
That would remind you who's on top of the food pyramid, really, truly, honestly, in a hurry, wouldn't it?
Yeah, without technology, we would not be sitting on top.
Going back to your comments about glyphosate, it's been our experience that if we want soils to really regenerate rapidly, every time we've experienced these 0.5% organic matter per year surges, obviously we have to have the right geology base and crop mix and crop rotation, et cetera. And there's a lot of pieces that have to align for that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the pieces that needs to be in place for that to happen is that we need to remediate glyphosate in the soil profile.
Yeah.
And I think while the story and the awareness has certainly spread within the agriculture community of the implications of the impact that glyphosate can have, it's still not something that is as well understood as it could be. What comments do you have to share? What are the implications of glyphosate that you discovered that really surprised you or that were unexpected?
In sort of looking into it, you sort of have to go back. You have to sort of go to the primary literature because there's so much stuff, sort of on the web and in the activist world, both pro and anti-GMO, that deals with glyphosate. That you sort of need to go to the primary literature and the history of it. And to me, it was really quite telling when I realized that there were two things that glyphosate was actually patented for. And its original patent was as a mineral chelator, something that would bind up mineral elements. It was patented to be, I think it was a pipe cleaner, a scale cleaner, something to clean mineral crud out of the inside of pipes. And the other patent was much more recently. I think it was, I forget if it was in the 80s or 90s, but as an antibiotic. And a lot of the arguments about why glyphosate is not dangerous to people is the tests that were done on it in terms of the effect of glyphosate on mammalian tissues didn't show a whole lot of toxicity. But the studies that have been coming out in Europe for the last 5 years or so on the effects of glyphosate on the gut microbiota of cows, chickens, pigs, and I think goats, if I'm remembering all this correctly, are actually pretty amazing. That there's large impacts on the gut microbiota at fairly small doses, and because it's an antibiotic. And the potential for there to be high sort of secondary disruption, if you will, in terms of both human health and livestock health from glyphosate exposure, I think is much larger than is generally recognized by regulatory agencies or the general public, because it's been thought of as something that has low direct toxicity, but the vector, the pathway of impact, may actually be indirect through disrupting one's gut microbiome, which we've all heard about a lot about in the last few years. But one of the difficult things about then connecting direct impacts are that everybody's gut microbiome is different. And so if glyphosate's disrupting that in people, you might have the effects be manifest in very different ways. And epidemiology and scientists are not very good at trying to connect those kinds of dots through this sort of a Wild West middleman of the gut microbiome, where we don't even know who the players are yet, let alone what they do with each other. And the soil is not dissimilar. The root microbiome of plants is incredibly complex. You take a random sample of soil and census the bacterial community and the fungal community in it, and half of them come up unknown. And a lot of the functions that they serve to promote the health of the plants that they are partnered with or they live around in the root zone come through community interactions. And imagine what we would know about sort of the ecology of Australia if all we knew was about koala bears or
kangaroos.
Yeah, exactly. We knew one species. You don't understand the interactions, or if they all look the same. And a big problem with understanding microbial ecology, of course, is that to our senses, the things we're naturally equipped to look for patterns in, the visual world in particular, they all look the same. They're little single-celled blobs. We have to rely on their chemical interactions to understand how they interact ecologically. And we're kind of at the point today in understanding soil ecology that the macroscopic ecologists were back in the mid-19th century, and starting to understand food webs and interactions and predator-prey relationships. We're back at that kind of square one, I think, in terms of soil. So what is it that glyphosate's doing to the soil? The studies that I've looked at suggests that it's not so much changing the total amount of life in the soil, but it's changing the community composition of that life. So if you just look at, say, bacterial abundance, you may have the same amount of bacteria in a non-sprayed and a sprayed field, but the players will be different. And I think the fungal density is more sensitive, if I'm recalling that right. Now I've forgotten where you started with the question, but there's a lot of impacts that can be looked at through the lens of disruption of soil microbiota and gut microbiota that really deserve an awful lot more attention and scrutiny in terms of looking at the effects of glyphosate. And I suspect that when we do, we'll find that a lot of the effects that are being attributed sort of generally to GMOs in the activist world will be looked at, but these are actually effects not so much from the GMO crop, but from the glyphosate that was used in conjunction with the GMO crop.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And there's two comments that I would add to that. One of them is there's this entire body of research around developing disease suppressive versus disease enhancing soils.
Yeah.
It's become clear from a purely experiential, practical perspective, as well as being supported by the theories of disease suppressive soil, that glyphosate directly leads to producing a disease enhancing soil, which is going to induce more root pathogenicity, etc.
Yeah, which is going to increase the market for pesticides. What a brilliant business model.
It is at that.
Yeah. One of the big surprises for me in researching the hidden half of nature was looking back at how deeply rooted, if you'll pardon the pun, in botanical science that recognition of disease suppressive soils actually is. It goes back to 1911 or something with Hiltner, looking at those kind of experiments that if you grow a plant in a sterile soil versus a plant in a life-filled soil, the one in the sterile soil succumbs to pests and pathogens. The ones in the soil that have a lot of life don't. And it's really counterintuitive if we think about bacteria and fungi as just germs, as things that are bad to health. It only makes sense if we think about them as communities that are actually engaged in interactions with higher organisms in ways that support their health. And that sort of realization, that lens, if you will, is an incredibly important one to get across, not just in agriculture, but also in medicine.
I think an additional implication of the conversation we've been having around glyphosate is we need to ask the question about what really stands behind food allergies. I mean, when you think about those two words in conjunction, a food allergy, why on earth would we be allergic to food? It makes no sense. And when you think about the most common food allergies, being milk, eggs, wheat, those are all animal products, or in the case of wheat, a plant product, which are often, usually, associated with elevated levels of glyphosate.
Yeah, and I've been researching this new book on soil health, human health connections, and one of the things we've been asking people about, and we've talked to some doctors about, are people who have examples of patients who had, say, real wheat intolerance problems, but then they shifted to just eating organically grown ancient varieties of wheat, and their so-called gluten intolerance went away. Now, I'm not arguing that gluten intolerance is not a real thing, but I do wonder whether or not some of the symptoms that some people exhibit that are being attributed to that are actually due to things like you're suggesting, whether it's the burn down of glyphosate.
I'm not even suggesting that it's the presence of glyphosate within the food that is being consumed, although it can be. But is it also possible that it could be the presence of glyphosate shifting the gut microbiome such that foods that we should not be allergic to, we now are?
Oh, I don't know. That's an interesting idea. I'm not sure. I think that there is a higher potential than most people recognize for sort of residual levels of glyphosate, if you will, to affect the human gut microbiome. I can't find any studies that have actually looked at that. I've only been able to find them in livestock. I don't imagine we're so different from livestock biologically that there wouldn't be the potential for some kind of an effect. Whether or not it extends to the kind of shift you were just suggesting, I don't know. That's a really interesting idea.
David, what is a book or a resource? Obviously, you have your own books, which I very highly recommend. What is a resource that you would recommend for farmers or growers to pay attention to?
Oh boy. I just read Gabe Brown's new book, Dirt to Soil. It's a really nice description of his experience. It's sort of the personal experience of a farmer going through his evolution into regenerative agriculture. It's not a technical book, but it's fairly short. It's well written. It's inspiring. I definitely recommend that one. Anyone who's interested in trying to look at how do you do no-till in organic systems, I think Jeff Moyer's organic no-till book is actually really instructive and interesting. It's more of a how-to way to go about things. And for the really big picture of sort of connecting regenerative farming to eating and the world in cities, I really like Dan Barber's The Third Plate. It's a good read. He's a great writer, and he connects stuff to food. And I think that one of the real connections that needs to be developed in the regenerative space is this connection between how we treat the land, how that essentially spirals up into the health of people as well. And it's through both the positive benefits of growing more nutrient dense food, which is something that we're looking into, and there's some studies started on. But it's also through reducing the use of things like glyphosate and other pesticides, and getting those out of our food as much as possible.
In a couple of moments, David, you've mentioned the implications of regenerative agriculture being able to produce more nutrient-dense food. I believe that that is something that can and does happen, but I'd love to hear your perspective. What are you discovering in the research that you're doing?
Well, the first thing that we were discovering is that there's been too few studies that have been looking to document that. Most studies look at organic versus conventional, and I've been on organic farms that have destroyed their soil and conventional farms that are pretty regenerative. So I think that a lot of the meta studies that are out there that are just pitched around, is organic better than conventional, are kind of missing the real question. And there's an example that hopefully will grow into a study from Northern Oregon that made a real impression on me last year, where there was a farmer down there who I went down and talked at a conservation district presentation. And there was a farmer who had done a 2-year running experiment with 2 fields with the same cultivar of wheat planted in them, both of which were no-till, and one of which he used glyphosate fallow as a rotation, and the other in which he used wheat and a complex mixture of cover crops in between his wheat crops. So he wanted to test whether or not he could use cover crops instead of glyphosate and what it would do for his yield. But he also was then asking the question, he is asking me afterwards whether or not I thought there'd be any difference in the mineral content of the wheat grown in those 2 fields. And I was like, well, let's test it. I don't know. So we got samples from that harvest from both of those fields, ran them through a mass spec, and looked at the mineral micronutrient differences. And the field that had just 2 years of cover crops instead of glyphosate had anywhere from 20 to 40, 50% higher mineral micronutrient levels for the kind of things you might want, like zinc, for example. And, I sort of came back and went, wow, those are big jumps in numbers over 2 years. These are fields like right next to each other. They had the same weather in the same parent material, same farmer. The only difference was how he treated the land for 2 years. And the only way that I can make sense out of that is that by going through the diverse mixture of cover crops, he was rebuilding the mycorrhizal fungi and bacterial relationships in the soil that allowed his crop to actually extract more zinc from the mineral particles in the soil. Because you couldn't change the zinc concentration of the soil itself in 2 years unless you added a bunch of zinc, which he didn't do. But you could get more out of the soil if you brought the biology back, which you can do in a season or 2. So I've started to become very interested in just how fast we could boost the mineral micronutrient and phytochemical content of foods using regenerative practices. But frankly, we need more data. We need more comparisons. I think there's data out there in the world, but not a lot of it has made it into the scientific journals yet.
I would agree. There's a lot of experiential data that I think many farmers and agronomists have that they've observed and can report on, but it's not peer-reviewed, replicated studies, etc.
Yeah, and it would actually be great to compile a bunch of that experiential stuff, because the peer-reviewed and replicated, there's a reason for that, and it's all very good. But experience is worth something too, and I'd love to see more of that reported.
Absolutely. David, what is a question you wish I would have asked?
Oh, well, when my band was playing next.
You play in a band?
Yeah, I play in two. One's called Big Dirt, and I'm the guitar player. I've done that for we've been 20 years.
I can't imagine you had anything to do with coming up with the name of that band now, did you?
Oh, you actually, yeah. But that one, it's a Seattle-based rock, country-ish rock band, Big Dirt. We're on iTunes, on all that kind of stuff. And I'm also the bass player in a new band called Good Bones that you can find on Spotify. Good Bones. We just put our first album out last month, and I'm the old guy in the band. It's a great band. It's a Seattle pop rock band. It's a lot of fun.
Good. Important to have fun. Life is too short not to have fun.
Exactly.
Wonderful. David, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast and for sharing your thoughts with our audience. And I really appreciate it and look forward to having you back at some point.
Great. Thank you, John. I appreciate talking to you, and keep up all your good work as well.
Thank you, David.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we measure, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data and knowledge and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.